Then I'd like to introduce Dr. Stacey Tucci.
Georgia Pathway to Language and Literacy. So Victoria talked to you about it a little bit, and I'm going to kind of do somewhat of a deep dive into what we're doing in Georgia. I'm sure that you're already doing a lot of what we're doing, but I think we're doing some really innovative work around systems and really looking at how children move from birth to literacy. And that there isn't any one department or professional or agency that's responsible for DHH children's literacy. It really is a system or an ecosystem, if you will. And unless we start getting all of the stakeholders together who are responsible for children's early language acquisition and for their later literacy, you know, one hand is doing a really great job and the other hand is doing a really great job, but it's not very effective in terms of the work because they're not working in tandem. You know, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so we have duplication of work, we have really quality services in some areas of the state, but it's not so great in other areas of the state. And so figuring out how we can really create a connected system, or what we say in Georgia, an ecosystem, because it's not just this flat linear type of work. There are all these multidimensional levels at each transaction point from birth to literacy that we have to be connected if we're going to get effective outcomes for our children. So very quickly, introduction to myself. I got into the field about 17 years ago when my stepdaughter came to live with me. She was born profoundly deaf. She was unilaterally implanted. And at the age of 5, we weren't really seeing the type of language, spoken language development we would have expected from how great her audiogram looked. So we started doing sign language in conjunction with her spoken language therapies, and we just saw a huge change in our child. And it was, again, you're gonna make me hold this? Okay. I use my hands when I talk, so hopefully I won't, you know, punch myself in the face with this thing. So it was just really difficult being a young parent and trying to learn how to do all of these different interventions and figure out how to talk to professionals. And you just said auditory neuropathy, and I don't even know what that means. And that is, in fact, what our daughter has, is auditory neuropathy. And so that's why we needed to look at different modes of communication with Amaya so that she could be more successful. But really trying to navigate that as a young parent was really difficult. So I thought, how do I help other parents who are doing this? And I ended up going to school to be a teacher of the deaf, and it kind of snowballed. And I ended up getting my PhD, which just opened a lot of doors up for me. I had so many opportunities to do so many incredible things. I've been all over the world consulting about deaf education. So I'm really excited to kind of bring that back to Georgia and now hopefully to Florida, because I think that's really what's helped me do my work, is that because I'm a parent, I always bring it back to the child. And when you start to do this work, especially if you start to do some across agency or across department work, you're going to get into some sticky situations and have some sticky conversations at times. And I think if you can keep bringing it back to the child, that will be one of the things that'll help you get through some of this work. So I am now the director to Georgia Pathway to Language and Literacy. I've been in this position for 3 years now, and we're looking to make a transition to a full-time permanent position at the Georgia Department of Education. I've been a full-time director, but I've been funded by a grant from the Oberkotter Foundation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But what is Georgia Pathway? Georgia Pathway is a statewide coalition that is looking at the language acquisition and literacy rates for students who are deaf and hard of hearing across the state of Georgia. And we work with any and everybody that is a stakeholder in children who are deaf and hard of hearing in their language and literacy journey. So if you have a dog in the fight, I want you involved in the pathway work, because unless we're all working together, then we're working against one another. So those outliers, I'm trying to bring them into the fold. You're always going to have them, but we really are trying to move from the fringe to the middle. And if you know anything about Michelle at Flagler, she runs a group called the Radical Middle. And it's really looking at the child and coming from a place of what does this child need, instead of trying to say this is what I believe and forcing the child into that belief. And that's really where we're working in Georgia Pathway, from that philosophy of what does this child need and what does this family need and how do we get it to them. So we work with the Department of Public Health, the Department of Education. We have a Department of Early Care and Learning that looks at child care centers and preschools. So we're working with all three of those departments, as well as medical professionals, teachers, universities, early interventionists, parents, families, adults who are deaf and hard of hearing, and any and everybody, like I said. And that can be a little bit challenging at times, but you start to sort of learn how to do that if you work from what a framework that I'm going to talk about, which is collective impact. So what is the goal of Georgia Pathway? Well, the goal of Georgia Pathway is that all Georgia children who are deaf and hard of hearing will be on a path to grade level reading proficiency by 2020. So there are a couple of things to talk to you about in terms of this goal. First, why third grade reading? You probably already know, right? But that's that crux year. You go from being taught how to read to being expected to learn content area material from reading. And that's really where a lot of our students ceiling. They never make it past that grade level. And why is that so important? Well, we can actually predict a lot of adult outcomes from whether or not you're a proficient reader in the third grade. We can predict high school graduation rates. We can predict college enrollment. We can predict incarceration rates. We can predict dependence on social welfare programs, and we can predict overall adult health. So this is a big thing that affects children throughout their life. And so this idea of third grade reading is something that we are really rallying around in Georgia. And we didn't come up with that idea. It's not a novel idea to Georgia Pathway. In fact, our governor, Nathan Deal, his wife is a teacher. She's very interested in literacy. And so he made a promise when he was running for governor that he would create a campaign called the Get Georgia Reading Campaign. And actually, this goal is the goal for our state. So our governor says that all children in the state of Georgia will be on a path to grade level reading proficiency by 2020. And what we've done is we've taken that larger state momentum, we've brought it down to our smaller subpopulation, and we have that same goal for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Because to give you an idea of what's going on in the state of Georgia, about 33% of Georgia students read on grade level in the third grade. And that's a cross-section of the entire population. About 33%, that's it. Guess what the number is for children who are deaf and hard of hearing? Just take a stab. Just somebody throw out a number. If it's 33% for a cross-section, you're saying it's 5%. That's a really good estimate. It's actually 3%. 3%, and let me back up and give a little disclaimer about that 3%. 3% of children who are receiving special education services in the state of Georgia with a primary eligibility of deaf and hard of hearing, 3% of that population are reading on grade level in the third grade. So if we talk about children who are receiving special education services with a secondary or a tertiary eligibility of DHH, something else is primary, that means that's probably going to bring that number down. And in the state of Georgia, we can't actually track those kids right now. So that's one of the major issues that we're finding in state data, is that we can't track children by anything other than a primary eligibility in terms of academic outcomes or academic scores. It's a huge problem. But there's a small uptick as well in that percentage, is that if you are a DHH student who is not receiving special education services, you're being served on a 504, or you are in the general education classroom and you're not receiving special education services, we can't track you either in the state of Georgia. So likely that's going to bring that percentage up a bit too. But if we're looking at some national numbers, we're only talking about, while it's statistically significant, we're only talking about 20 to 30% of our typical population that's in the gen ed classroom. So it's not a huge percentage. 70% of our kids, if you're looking at national numbers, those are not Georgia numbers, but if you're just taking an average across the nation, about 20 to 30% of your DHH population is in the gen ed classroom without services. And then the other 70% are in special ed. So we are still accounting for the majority of our students in that 3%. And that's really, really scary. So we may, you know, our secondary and tertiary kids may bring us down to 2%, and then our gen ed kids may bring us up to, say, 8%. But even though 33% isn't good as a general percentage, that's still an incredible change from 33% of our kids reading on grade level in the 3rd grade to 3% or 8% reading on grade level who are deaf and hard of hearing. So this is basically a crisis for our kids. And that's where Georgia Pathway, we were looking at these numbers, and that's where this coalition, this group of people, that's where we really came from. The other thing I want to say about this is a lot of people look at me and they say, all? You mean like 100%, 100% of kids who are deaf and hard of hearing are going to read on grade level? And I have to tell you, that gave me a little bit of heartburn when I first took the position as director, because coming from a university and being a researcher and looking at human behavior and bell curves and all that kind of stuff, I mean, who in the heck ever gets 100% or 0%, right? I mean, that's just 100% is a pretty lofty goal, or no percent is a pretty lofty goal, depending on, you know, what you're looking at. And I had a really hard time not feeling like I was sort of spewing some rhetoric or some political propaganda, if you will, in sharing that goal when I first started. And I had a colleague of mine, she's a woman of color. She could tell, we've known each other for a while, she could tell I had some weirdness about that goal. And she said, sit down and talk to me about how you're feeling about this all or 100%. And I said, I want to be authentic in our work. And I don't want to be over-promising something, you know, that I don't know that we can deliver. And she said, I hear that, I get you. But what I want to say to you is, especially as a person of color, is what percentage of children that don't succeed is okay? Is it 20%? Is it 15%? Is it 66% like we currently have in Georgia? Like, what percentage of children who are not going to be successful is okay with you? And if you can give me a number and you can rationalize it, then hey, maybe we'll renegotiate what this goal is. And that really stopped me in my tracks. But then she said, the other thing is, even if we could come to a number about the children who are not going to succeed, who gets to decide who those kids are? Is it the kids in the rural area because it costs more to get services to them? Is it the kids from high poverty areas because it's harder to reach their parents and get their parents involved? Is it the kids of color? Is it the families who come in speaking languages other than English? Who gets to decide which of the kids go in that percentage that don't succeed? And she really kind of brought me to my knees. I had what my grandma would call a come to Jesus moment, because that really spoke to me. That resonated with me about, what does this mean when you set a goal, and how can you be authentic around a goal of 100%? Now, does that mean that I'm expecting us to get to 100% by 2020? Maybe not, but that's my goal. So if I shoot for the stars, I land by the moon, right? Did I say that in reverse? If you shoot for the moon, you land in the stars. However that works. That's kind of our thing. High expectations. Historically, we have had low expectations for our students who are deaf and hard of hearing, and what we expect is what we get. So I'd rather overshoot and wind up higher than I ever imagined than undershoot and hold back what we could have actually accomplished. And that's where I would say to you is probably your first takeaway around this work is shoot high. Go for the 100%. Go for the all. Because when is it ever okay for a child not to succeed? It's not. It's just not. All right, getting started. So I knew nothing about collective impact framework or collective impact theory until I took this position, so I had a really steep learning curve, but it is incredible. And if more of us learned about this, I think we'd be solving a lot of our issues a lot more effectively and a lot more efficiently. This is a really great website to go to, and Victoria, you can share this PowerPoint with anybody if, there's nothing sensitive in here. So this is a really great website to kind of go and sort of get some rudimentary information about what collective impact theory or framework is all about. And it's really a framework for tackling complex social issues in the nonprofit world, in the education world, in the policy world. I mean, people use it all over the place. I just never used it in the education field. And there are 5 major elements of collective impact. And they make so much sense. I'm like, why did I not know about this before? I mean, it's pretty logical what they're asking us to do. So the first is a common agenda. Keeps everybody moving towards the same goal. The second is common progress measurements. Can we get to our true outcome? Are we actually measuring what we say we're going to measure? We talk about this all the time with kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. We give them an assessment for math, but what we really just did was measure their language ability. We didn't measure their math content knowledge. So are we really using assessments that show us what we need to know and getting to the true goal that we're moving towards? The next is mutually reinforcing activities, and this can be a challenge, especially if you have people who are coming from different viewpoints, who value different endpoints. So this takes some work. Believe me, I will try to be as transparent as possible. Georgia Pathway and the work we do takes work. And I have just as many sticky conversations in my job 3 years later and in Georgia Pathway's existence 8 years later as I did when I first started and it's when Georgia Pathway started. That stuff never goes away, right? You just get better at dealing with it. You get better at saying, you're not my enemy, I still don't agree with you, but I can put that aside and do this work. Whereas when we first started, we had people who wouldn't even sit on the same side of the room who now request to be in groups with one another when we do breakout sessions. It's really incredible, but it takes time and it takes a focus on building those relationships and some real soul searching into the humanity of the work you're doing. Because ultimately it's really easy to make that person that doesn't agree with you your enemy. But if you look at why they hold that belief so passionately, it's probably because they really think that's what's best for kids. And if you really think that what you're doing is best for kids, and they really think that what they're doing is best for kids, you already have a common goal. It's doing what's best for kids. You just have to figure out how to make those two different philosophies or pathways work together instead of work in opposition. Communications. This is a struggle for me. I am still the only full-time person on Georgia Pathway. Everyone else that works on Georgia Pathway works on a volunteer basis. I do have a small annual budget that I can contract with people at some times, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But basically, a lot of this work relies on me having relationships with people so that when I go and make that ask, can I use your facility for free? Can DOE pay for all of my ASL interpreters every single time I have a meeting? Those things really depend on me having a good relationship with my stakeholders and also doing what I say I'm going to do, showing up when I say I'm going to show up, following through with the deliverables that I've promised. And so that's really, really important. Don't overpromise, because you start to lose trust with your stakeholders when you don't deliver. And a lot of this work, especially in the beginning, is going to be on shoestring budget. You have to kind of have some data behind you. You have to have some outcomes before you can really get people to start putting money and time and positions behind what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish. And the last but not least is a backbone organization. And right now we have what I would call a vertebrae. That would be me. And then I have the beginnings of a backbone, but there's really no one who, like I said, is devoted 40 hours a week or 80 hours a week or every minute you're alive a week to this work.
But I do have some really major players that help me out, and so I would consider those people a part of my backbone organization. Common agenda. So pretty clear what a common agenda is, but it's really about coming up with joint approaches. And this is where in Georgia Pathway we've reframed the conversation around deaf kids. We are so not interested in the language wars in Georgia. It's gotten us nowhere. Children's outcomes are almost at the same place they were if we look at outcomes 50 years ago, 75 years ago, 100 years ago. Like back when we were institutionalizing children who are deaf and hard of hearing, we still don't have much better outcomes for the majority of our population now. And that scares me to death. And it's really a social justice issue, right? I mean, these kids have the right to be literate people and to be functioning human beings. And we're doing a disservice to them by fighting over whose way is right, because there is no one right way. What works for Amaya, my daughter, is not going to work for my best friend's son. And in fact, it didn't. And so a lot of the advice that I gave her, she had to pick and choose what worked for her and what worked for her child. He got bilaterally implanted. She was implanted 18 years ago. He was bilaterally implanted at 10 months. Well, the first one at 10 and then the second one around 16 months. And he's taken off and he uses listening and spoken language. They haven't introduced ASL. He doesn't need it. That didn't work for my child. And there's no competition between us. She learns from me, I learn from her. And now that he's a little bit older, he's actually now learning ASL. And it's incredible because it's just no big thing. And I talked to my daughter, who is 22 now, and I ask her questions about, what is your experience? And do you feel like you have to, defend your choices in language? And she's like, my friends and I don't talk about that stuff. When I'm with my deaf friends, I sign. I turn my voice off because that's what we do. When I'm with my hearing friends, I still have the sign creep up, but I talk because that's what they can understand. I have to make sure they're looking at me a lot of the time so I can look at their lips and speech read. But she's like, it's not a thing. And my friends who are hard of hearing, some of them do both. And some of them only talk. She's like, we don't have those kinds of conversations. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I'm the idiot, right? Because the parents are always the idiot, right, when it comes to your kids. But what she did was she changed my perception of what's going on. We're putting the war on them. They have no war. It doesn't exist with these kids. We are doing it to them, and that's not fair. So really reframing this conversation and making it about literacy. We know from early brain science that language is language is language. The brain absolutely, positively does not discriminate. Spoken language, signed language, both languages, it does not discriminate. It loves language. It's like creme brulee. It eats it up. It's fantastic. So we got to get over this whole my language is better than yours, or you have this primary language, so that means you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and you have this primary language, so you can only do A, B, and C. It's total crap, guys. And the science has proven it to be crap. Language is language is language. The brain doesn't care. Language is the necessary foundation for literacy. So if you don't develop language, you are probably not going to be a reader. And very, very, very few of our kids come to us with age-appropriate language, which gets back to my idea or my point about this idea of a system, an ecosystem. You can be the best teacher in the world, but if your child is coming to you with a 3-year or more language delay, you are swimming upstream for the rest of that child's academic career. And it makes things so much harder than it has to be. So what we've really tried to do in Georgia is stop being the Department of Education and start being Georgia Pathway. means the Department of Public Health, which oversees our early intervention from birth to 3 and oversees transition from Part C to Part B, they have to be involved. And we have to play fair. They have to know about where the kids are going when they get to DOE, and DOE needs to know about where they came from when they were in DPH. And those people didn't even talk to each other, and their buildings were in walking distance in downtown Atlanta. So, you know, there's some really serious issues going on with the system, and our kids are the ones who are paying the price. So we really have tried to use this goal of literacy to reframe the whole conversation around deaf kids. Don't talk to me about modality. Talk to me about language. Don't talk to me about language wars. Talk to me about literacy. So I don't care how a child develops language. I just want them to have age-appropriate language when they hit 3 years of age, right? When it's time for them to transition out of early intervention into the school-age population, I want them to have age-appropriate language, and I don't care what it is, and I don't care how they got there. And I don't care if 28 of your kids did really great with that. The 29th kid is probably not going to work for them. Like, stop thinking that you figured it out for every child, because you haven't. It just doesn't work like that. So we've really worked hard. I'm not pretending that we've got it all figured out or that we don't still have arguments. I'll give you a little anecdote. And somebody needs to keep me abreast of time because I'm a talker. And I'll talk to you all day. I thought we had until 5 o'clock, and then I saw we were leaving around 12:30, and I was like, okay, Stacey, speed along, speed it up. We just passed a bill in Georgia. We're waiting for the governor to sign it, and it's a language acquisition and literacy bill for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. It, in fact, codifies that the Department of Public Health, the Department of Education, and the Department of Early Care and Learning have to work together. It actually puts it in law that they have to meet, they have to work together, they have to share data. It's all there. It was an incredible journey. But I had someone call me and say, well, something was posted on the Georgia Pathway Facebook page and it felt very Big D deaf and I don't like it. And I was like, well, I posted it. I'm the only person that posted. And so, and did you see the post right before it that talked about how important hearing aid usage was in terms of language, spoken language development? So what's the problem here? And she's like, well, so she didn't like a term on this post that I put that was around, talking to parents about Big D deaf culture. She didn't like a term on this flyer that I shared on the Facebook page. She thought it wasn't inclusive. And she was like, and these people are in the bill work group meetings, and I just feel like we did all this work and we passed this law, and I mean, we haven't gotten anywhere. And I was like, do you speed? Do you ever speed? Because there's lots of laws about speeding, and you probably still do it, right? There's all kinds of traffic violations that you probably do every single day that all have laws against them. And, you know, think about what we're going through in our country right now. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Just because we passed a law that says that we're all the same, we all have the same types of civil rights, the same rights as human beings, we still have racism and prejudice in our country. So to think that somebody is going to change their mind simply because a law was passed is kind of, you know, a fairy tale. Not to mention I didn't particularly agree with her issue with the term in the first place, but just to give you an idea, it's not as if we have it all figured out. And just because we have a really great victory, that we still don't have growing pains and we still don't have people who don't get along. We do. We have them and they're not going away. But you kind of get to the point where you're like, okay, how do I put this fire out and still focus on moving the work forward? And if I didn't have a really good relationship with this person, she probably could have made a mountain out of a molehill and caused a big stink, but I talked her back down off the ledge. And, you know, you start to figure out, how do I compare what's happening here with something that's far? I mean, we think we're so important in the world of deaf ed, right? Like, things are just so huge. And I'm like, There's bigger things out there in the world. Think about it. Like, come back down, have a little perspective. Like, is this really that bad? Is this really life or death? Do you understand, in the grand scheme of what we're trying to do, why this one offense is probably not all that important to children's literacy outcomes? Like, is this about you or is this about the kids? If it's about you, I don't really have time for that. Because I have 97% of the children in Georgia who aren't going to become readers. I don't really have time for your personal affronts, but I can't have that kind of conversation with those kinds of people if I don't have a good foundational relationship, if I can't say the hard truths. So relationship building is huge, and this is going to be a huge piece of that. Shifting that paradigm, really refocusing what we're doing to talking about literacy instead of getting jammed up around modality. So we have a Birth to Literacy plan. You have it here. And this is kind of the beginning of our common agenda. And so what you'll see is that we start prenatally and we move to 5 to 8 years of age. So we're saying 8 years of age because the typical child should be about 8 years old in the 3rd grade. And we've broken down the major stakeholder groups. So the yellow color would be your medical professionals. The green are your parents, family, caregivers. That purpley gray are your early interventionists and your child care providers, and then that darker blue are your educational professionals. And what we've tried to do is who's responsible and for what at what point in time on this child's journey. And this is just very, very, very simplistic. But a parent could sit down and they could go, okay, my child is 3 months old. What am I supposed to be doing at 3 months of age that's moving my child towards literacy? So it's a common agenda that we can all refer to. And then it also gives us some of the major transactions that are happening along this journey. So we can say, all right, when we're evaluating the system, are we doing really well with that 3-month diagnostic testing? What do our benchmark numbers look like in Eddie at 3 months of age? And we can all evaluate that and say, all right, that transaction is working really, really well. Do we need to replicate it outside the metro area, or is it working well across the state? All right, we don't need to mess with that. We're doing really well across the state with diagnosis by 3 months of age. So what's next? All right, enrollment in early intervention at 6 months of age, not doing so hot there. So how do we tackle that problem? And do we have a problem? Do we have the same problem in the metro area that we have in the rural areas? No, actually we don't. So how do we leverage expertise in rural areas, and how do we leverage expertise in the metro area to solve that transaction issue? So this is just a really nice plan. You're welcome to take it and change it. I will send you a editable copy instead of just a PDF that you guys can use. This is a living document. And what we're working on now is trying to make it a living document for parents. So what's missing on this? Can anybody just say that? Families are there. What's on this document is what the adults should be doing. What's not on this document is what the child should be doing. That's a huge oversight. To me, that really speaks volumes about our perspective. Yes, we are looking at it from a systems level, but we've still lost a little bit of focus around the fact that the major end user of this system is the child. So we want to add on. So here's what adults do. Now we want to have a secondary copy that has what the children do. And what we'd really like to do is make it living, make it digital. So a parent could click on 3 months and diagnostic testing. They could put their zip code in, and then it would pull up all of the pediatric audiologists within a 25, 10, 50-mile radius of that zip code. And so now this document is actually a living guide, a living digital guide to help drive that parent to what it is they need to do. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but the other thing that's been a huge paradigm shift for us is, as the professionals, we're so used to being the experts. But all of this, children are a product of their families. They really are. That's why parent engagement is the number one predictor, or number 1-2 predictor, depends on what research you read, of children's academic outcomes. Families matter. And we're so worried about what we know that we forget about how do we transfer what we know to the parent and lift up their capacity to do. I'll give you another anecdotal. I taught kids who were profoundly deaf, who were in kindergarten. Most of my students came from households that spoke Spanish in the home. Very few of my parents learned to sign, for many, many, many different reasons, and not one of them was because those parents didn't love their kids to the very depth and core of who they were. I've been signing for 17 years, and I still wouldn't get up there and do what the interpreter is doing right now, right? I mean, so no judgment there whatsoever. But I can hold my own. And I had a student who was stealing candy from the grocery store because he did not understand that if you did not pay for it, that was stealing. You know, he just thought, I want that gum, I'm putting it in my pocket, and that's going to be my gum. So his mother brought him to my classroom and told me through the Spanish interpreter, can you please explain to X why he can't take gum at the grocery store, that it's stealing, he could get in trouble, blah, 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 blah. And then I did it. And I had my deaf para at the time walked in on what I was doing, and she just, you know, mouth open, was so upset with me. I had no idea why she was upset with me. She let me finish my spiel. They left, and she said, you just disempowered that parent. Instead of sitting down with that parent and signing simplistically to her what she needed to sign to her child, you took her role and you signed for her, and you taught her that child. You taught her child that lesson instead of allowing her to teach her child that lesson. And she said, you're coming from a really good place. I'm not getting on to you, or I am getting on to you, but I love you, and that's why I'm getting on to you. And so it was a real come to Jesus moment for me about what does parent empowerment really look like for professionals? Because, you know, these kids matter so much to us. They really become they become your surrogate children a lot of the times, especially if you have that language mismatch in the home where you feel like you're the only one that can talk to that child. And that same family, X was shooting birds in school, and he got in trouble, and he got in trouble, and he got in trouble, and finally he lost all his pennies in his bank. His, you know, they earn pennies in their bank, and then at the end of the week, they could go and they could buy something from our classroom store, and he lost every single penny, and he had like 150, which was like a lot of pennies for the week. And, you know, I made the decision. We dealt with it at school. I'm not gonna call mom. I'm not gonna tell her about it. We let it go, and the next day, the Spanish interpreter is coming to my room saying, Mom's on the phone and she wants to talk to you. So I go into the conference room, we get on conference call, and she was like, X came home and he said he was shooting birds and he lost all the pennies in his bank and now he can't buy anything, and I want to know what's going on. I thought that child could not talk to his parents because they did not sign. Whatever they did at home, whether it was ASL or not, that child talked to his parents. And he told them an incredibly sophisticated, detailed story about what happened at school. And come to Jesus moment for me for 2 reasons. Number one, I made a decision about what information that parent was allowed to know about her child. And I'm sure communication partially factored into it. Am I really going to go through all of this? Are they even going to know what I'm talking about? So I'm just not going to call mama. And then the other thing that I did was I undervalued whatever communication was going on in the home, and I made the assumption there was no communication going on because I knew they didn't sign. Well, some kind of signing was going on because he couldn't write all of that. So whatever he did when he got home, he communicated with his mother. And that's why that's been a huge paradigm shift in this work, is that it's really about the parent and building capacity in the parent. And as a professional, it's our duty to make sure that that parent can do what they need to for their children. That's a really hard sell to audiologists. So when you start trying to work with DPH and medical professionals, requiring an audiologist to really talk to a parent about what does this mean, what does this device mean, what is maintenance and troubleshooting and follow-up and mapping and all of that, what does all of that mean? The onus is on that parent to lift that, the onus is on that audiologist to lift that parent's knowledge so they can do what they need to do. That's a really hard sell for some professionals. So just think about that our end user is the family and the child, but we make it about ourselves as professionals. So what's the problem? I already talked to you about this. 3%, horrible, can't locate secondary and tertiary kids, can't locate gen ed kids. So what this tells me mainly about gen ed kids, where my brain goes, is that those kids are academically successful. That's not to say that children in special ed aren't academically successful. Sometimes they're just there for access, right? You have to have a DHH eligibility to get an ASL interpreter. So don't get me wrong when I say gen ed kids are academically successful to mean that kids in special ed aren't also academically successful. I'm just saying these kids are on grade level without supports, and I can't locate them in Georgia, which means I can't operationalize their trajectory, and I can't replicate it. So I need to know, we focus so much on the kids who aren't doing well, right? That's where the fire is. So I'm putting all my water and my firemen and all of that there. But there's like a whole fire truck over here that I'm not even looking at. You know, there's a whole water basin over here that I'm not tapping into because that's not a threat to me right now. Those kids are doing well. I'm worried about the fire that's licking at my toes. But these kids have a lesson for us that makes sense for the kids who aren't doing so great. So we got to start focusing on the kids that are doing well, learning from them, operationalizing that trajectory, and replicating it. Shared measurement. I don't need to talk too much about this. We know how to measure in education as long as you remember, are you really measuring what you think you're measuring? And measurement can help you have a common language. So when I talk to my early interventionist at DPH, I can use measurements that speak to them that also speak to my DOE people. How do I talk to them about audiological measurements as they relate to language? So a lot of my audiologists in DPH never think about the fact that that consistent access to sound is actually one of the foundational pieces to literacy. I go talk to audiologists and they're like, wait, what? This kid is going to read or not read, and a lot of it hinges on what you're teaching that family to do with that device. Literacy, you are accountable as an audiologist for that child's literacy. And some of them don't like to hear that. And I'm just being very, very honest with you. So that's a huge paradigm shift for some people who are stakeholders in Pathway. But I can use my measurements and my assessments as a way to talk to them that makes them get it, that makes them make that connection. But you go to your, Academy of Audiologists and start telling them that they're responsible for children's literacy, and you see what they say to you. You learn really quickly what language you can use with people and what language you can't, and how to not be, as a teacher, because that's my background, teachers are still my peeps. I'd rather work with teachers than just about anybody else in Pathway. I love teachers so much. I'm still a teacher at heart. You have to be really careful to let that go, because it's really easy for us in education to blame what happened before they got to us. It's really, really easy. And, I've come in guns blazing a couple of times, and it did not help our situation. And I had to really do some, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. I'm really passionate. I hate to see these kids not doing as well as they should. I didn't mean to play the blame game with you. But that's really, really, really easy to do as an educator when you start backing up at looking at early intervention. So just note to self there. So we have an indicators map. You have that. And that's kind of an idea of how we're measuring our success. How are we measuring where we're going? So if you look at what's there, I have to use mine because I can't see the PowerPoint. All right, so let me back up really quickly. Remember I talked to you about Nathan Deal and the Get Georgia Reading campaign? So it was looking at literacy for all students who are deaf and hard of hearing. They have 4 pillars in their campaign. One of the pillars is climate or positive learning environment. One pillar is access. One pillar is language nutrition. We refer to language as if it's just like food nutrition. Language is the #1 driver of brain development. If you do not provide language early, you starve the brain. You literally change the physical and physiological structure of the brain if you do not get language early. And what I mean is language in the first 3 years of life, which for us in the Department of Education, that just sends chills down my spine because I'm not involved in birth to 3. That's DPH in Georgia. So that's why this ecosystem, this system's work is so very important. Children's brains who do not get exposed to early, consistent language, and we already know how many hours per week is necessary for optimal brain development. It's 35 hours per week. They only need 5 hours a day of language across 7 days a week. They only need 5 hours a day to have optimal brain development. That's not that much. That's really not that much when you think about it. An hour here, 30 minutes here, 15 minutes there, 5 hours a day. Across 7 days, 35 hours a week of language is the minimum necessary for optimal brain development. But it's got to happen in the first 3 years of life. So we're looking at language as if it's food nutrition, language nutrition, nutrition for the brain. So we've got climate or positive learning environment. We've got access, and that's access in every way every way you can define access, whether it's access this way or access this way, or if that means locational access. So we have a tale of 2 Georgias in Georgia. We have Metro Atlanta, where there's a whole smorgasbord of intervention services accessible to families. And then we have the rest of Georgia. We also know it as the zip code lottery. Your outcomes in life as a DHH child, or as any child, should not be determined by your zip code. But right now in the state of Georgia, that is absolutely a fact. If you were born in South Georgia, you are probably, and you are using sign language, you are probably one of 1 in your school using sign language. No one in your community uses sign language. So when that parent goes into an IEP and the school system decides that a full-time interpreter is just too much, and then they tell that parent, oh, you know, that we don't have the money for that. That parent has absolutely no information about how to fight that decision. And they are probably looking at that school system thinking that they are doing what's best for their child. And they are probably looking at that school system as if they are the authority, and they say, okay. Or they say, we'll provide an interpreter for your child, but that child doesn't have fluent signing skills. So they sit in a mainstream classroom with an interpreter and still get nothing because they don't know how to sign. Yes, maybe they need ASL as a language, but you have to learn that language before you can use an interpreter effectively. But parents don't know that, especially in rural areas where nobody else has a deaf kid that signs, or maybe nobody else even has a deaf kid. So thinking about access in all the different ways that access could be defined, that's what access means as a pillar. And then last but not least, professional development. So the Get Georgia Reading campaign is looking more at school-age populations. So they're looking at teacher prep and teacher effectiveness. But of course, what Pathway has done is we've said, okay, what do these 4 pillars mean for the DHH population? And so professional development is not just about teachers for the DHH population, right? It's also about these early interventionists. It's about medical professionals. So, you know, it changes a little bit. What these pillars mean for us change a little bit when we look at our population and some of their unique needs. But you'll see that overall we've got, under climate, we've got this universal principle. Deafness is actually not necessarily a disability, right? The disability is the language and literacy disorder or delay that comes after a child who's deaf or hard of hearing doesn't get what they need to develop. So we are in the business of prevention. And that's another paradigm shift when you start looking at Department of Education and how we work with kids with disabilities. We're all about remediation. Show me the delay and then I'll give you services. But when you start working with the Department of Public Health, they're all about prevention. I'd rather prevent a Zika outbreak than wait until it happens and then trying to figure out how to resolve the issue. I want to prevent that language disability. I want to prevent that literacy disability. So that's been a paradigm shift for the Department of Education, and our federal laws really don't back that up. So IDEA is not about prevention. The early intervention part of IDEA is about prevention, but IDEA in terms of your Part C or school age is not about prevention. It's about remediation. So we're starting to have some success stories in early intervention, and we're getting DHH 3-year-olds have age-appropriate language, and now they can't transition into special ed pre-K. So then from 3 to 5, they get no services, and all the good work we did from birth to 3, they regress from 3 to 5, and now they get in at 5, and now they're a special ed student. Woohoo, awesome. It's like, really? I mean, you just want to punch something sometimes. So we're working with a local school system who has taken a really innovative perspective around this, and they've got what's called a maintenance model. So for DHH kids coming in at 3 who are actually on age-appropriate language levels, they have a maintenance model where these kids are still eligible for special ed so that they can keep the services necessary to keep the language they're coming in with. And that's about as far as I know right now. I literally just heard about it about 3 weeks ago, and so that's my next point. I'm going there, I'm going to sit down with them, I'm going to talk to them. How are you rationalizing this? What are you doing? And so, you know, if we can kind of keep this conversation going between Georgia and Florida so we can learn from you and you can learn from us, I think it would be amazing, because my whole thing is this can be a national movement. It doesn't have to be a state movement. It can be a national movement. And there are going to be things that you guys, RMTC is the bomb. We have nothing like that in Georgia. And when you guys brought me out to do that training, and then there was all this follow-up where teachers could talk to each other, they had base camp, they could share what they were doing, they could ask for help. I am actually responding more frequently to Florida teachers about Foundations for Literacy than I am to Georgia teachers right now about their curriculum implementation. And we don't have that in Georgia. So I'm trying to look at how do I replicate this idea of what you have in Florida, in Georgia. And so there are going to be some good things we're doing in Georgia that you may not be doing. How do we share the good stuff across state lines and make this a nationwide movement instead of a state level movement? I kind of got myself off, but you can take a look at this. We have 3 major indicators that kind of fall in line with those pillars from the Get Georgia Reading campaign. We talk about the goal, the what. Again, you'll see that 100%. Just remember, you're going to have to rationalize that 100% to people, and I think I gave you 2 really good ways to do that. And then you're looking at criteria, measurement, and then below you've got some of our action projects. And if you want some more detailed information about some of these different action projects, I'd be happy to do that as well. Let's see what's next. Mutually reinforcing activities. So those action projects down below, those are kind of what we're getting at when you're talking about mutually reinforcing activities. Don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole. Leverage the unique expertise of your stakeholders and have them do what they're good at. So I work with the Auditory Verbal Center in Georgia. It is a private listening and spoken language, AVT, center in Georgia that provides intervention from 3 months all the way to adult age. And they are really, really good with telepractice. And so I'm trying to have that private program teach me about telepractice so then we can inform the state's telepractice around early intervention. I was just talking earlier, there is a center called the Marcus Autism Center in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia. They are doing some incredible synchronous and asynchronous coaching and telepractice through using technology. And you can go on, just Google Marcus Autism Center. You can take a look through what they're doing. The tech platform, what's in Jacksonville? What university is in Jacksonville here? University of Florida. I think the University of North Florida. I think the University of North Florida, if I'm correct, built that platform. And so what we're trying to do, I know it came from Florida. I want to say it came from North Florida, but I want to say it came out of Jacksonville, but I'll have to get for sure the details. But that's a resource you already have here in Florida. We're trying to figure out, can we get that platform from them and replicate what they're doing for kids with autism? So not only are they doing coaching for interventionists and for parents, both synchronous and asynchronous, but they're also doing types of digital assessments. So I've gone in and I've watched a couple of things where when you're looking at symptoms of autism and very young children, you have to be eagle-eyed to see the nuance between some of those behaviors. And I think I know what kids with autism, I think I know what some of the presentations of the behavior are. And so I sat down and did a couple of these little webinars that they had for parents. And they'll have like a 60-second clip of a child that has neurotypical behavior, of him responding to some kind of task. And it'll be split screen. So you'll watch that 60-second clip, and then you'll click next to it, and there'll be a 60-second clip of a child who has suspected autism. And the comparison, and he's responding to the same exact task that the first child is comparing to. When you see the comparison, it's so easy to see that this child probably has non-typical responses. But if I were to watch that child just in isolation, I might not have picked up on the fact that he wasn't responding. I might have thought that he just was uninterested in the task, not that that behavior was potentially a symptom of autism. So they are doing some incredible stuff that is leveraging a technological platform that was developed by a university here in Florida, and we're trying to figure out, is there a way that we can get that for DHH kids in Georgia? The other thing I'll tell you, because they're just little knowledge bombs that keep coming to my... Say that again?
The Autism Institute, the College of Men at FSU,
Mm-hmm.
they have all that.
So maybe it is FSU then. Maybe it is FSU.
With Dr. Weatherby, they
That name sounds very familiar. I don't know the details. I have a very superficial knowledge. Okay, so it's here. Marcus Autism Center. I forgot what I was going to say. No, that's okay. No, it's okay. It's totally okay. It might come to me. Anyway, so yeah, just thinking about what are your stakeholders really good at. The Auditory Verbal Center also serves a very large number of children who are Medicaid recipients. So sitting down with the director of that center and saying, talk to me about the Medicaid policies that are challenging for your clients. And what we found out is one of the things is in Georgia, you cannot be reimbursed as a provider. Only one provider can be reimbursed by Medicaid in a 24-hour period. That means if you're coming in from a rural area and you need to go see your audiologist to have your CI remapped, and then you're going to hop right over to your therapist and get some AVT training. After that, whoever files for that reimbursable code first gets paid, and the other person has to scholarship that visit. That is ridiculous. That means families that are coming from rural areas, if both providers are going to get paid for their work, that family has to stay overnight and take 2 days off work, and the children have to miss 2 days of school if both providers are going to be paid for their work. That's crazy. And so we either have providers who say, I'll just eat it this time and you pick it up next time. Or we have providers who are fighting with one another because they each want the reimbursement because they don't have a good enough relationship to say, I won't take it this time and you take it next time. Or we have providers who know that they're not going to get reimbursed, so they refuse to schedule appointments on days that they know other providers are seeing the children. So, I mean, think about the expertise of your stakeholders and take from that what you can. I'm not going to ask the auditory verbal center to start teaching sign in conjunction with their therapies. What I might be able to say is, hey, when you start to see that children aren't progressing using auditory verbal therapy alone, what would you feel comfortable with in terms of referral to programs that might also be offering sign in conjunction with spoken language therapy? And so once I've built this person up, you've got all this expertise in Medicaid, you've got all this expertise in telepractice. They know I value them. They're a little bit more opening to say, oh, okay, all right, this kid's not doing what we thought they were going to do. They're not making the progress we thought they should be. I'm actually open to suggesting a program that uses sign instead of saying, don't ever sign with your kid. They're never going to learn to talk. That door starts to open. That little tiny shift happens in the brain. And guys, this has been over 8 years of work. So Pathway was in existence for 5 years before I ever stepped into this role. And those years, that was necessary foundational building. But without a full-time person, a lot of your work becomes meetings where everybody talks this really nice, beautiful stuff, and then nothing ever happens after the meeting, right? Because we all go back to our full-time jobs and our families and all that kind of stuff, and you don't pick up that voluntary work. But when you have somebody like me calling you or showing up in your center or sending you 28 emails, I don't mean to pester you, but you said you would do this, then all of a sudden work starts happening. And then when you start seeing outcomes from the work, then I only have to send 5 emails to pester you instead of 28. And it's really cool because it's like a snowball effect. And you start small and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we've got a ton of things going on. I talked about some of the Medicaid policy changes. In Georgia, you could not get BAHA, if you were a Medicaid recipient, you could not get a BAHA on a softband. It was not covered because it was not considered an implantable device. Probably just an oversight in the way that that device was coded. But that meant that any child that needed a BAHA could not get it until it was implantable at 5 years of age. Or if they had some kind of, skull deformity that did not allow them to ever have the device implanted, they were never eligible for a BAHA if they were a Medicaid recipient. That has now been changed, but that took a 12-month fight with Medicaid to get that changed. So, I mean, there's this work takes time. You have to be a little bit hard-nosed and just keep at it and keep at it. And sometimes being the annoying person will get things done just as easily or just as effectively as being the friend or the confidant. We've passed our legislative efforts. We've done an entire audit of our early intervention system as run by state schools. So our Department of Public Health has an early intervention program that's a more general, wide-ranging program, and then our state schools also fund an offshoot of that that's specific to sensory disabilities. So we've done a complete audit and are working on structural and staffing changes and budget changes. We have a network planning grant. We've written for a lot of grants. Foundations for Literacy, which is the only evidence-based early literacy curriculum in the world for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, and I will come and train. It is really awesome. It really is awesome, guys. And developed out of Georgia State University. It's pretty reasonable in terms of cost as well. So if you're interested, let me know. All kinds of things. We've got tons and tons of things, but we're just now starting to pick up parent engagement and looking at parent advocacy training. So if you've got a Georgia Hands and Voices, they should have Astra training, which is a parent advocacy training. I just attended one in South Georgia, and it is awesome. I think there are probably a little tweaks that can be made because it's kind of high level for some parents, but we're working on that. It's copyrighted, so you can't really change it yet, but we're working on it. So there's lots and lots and lots of things going on. I talked about this already, probably ad nauseum, but this is all about a connected system. You do not get readers unless early intervention works together with the school-age population, school-age professionals. It just doesn't happen. So you have to start thinking about this from birth and what that journey looks like in Florida. Sketch it out. What are from the time that baby is born, what are the major transactions that happen from birth to 3rd grade? What are the major transactions that are necessary, that need to happen in a timely manner, and that need to happen in an effective manner for that child to get from birth to literacy? Sketch out what your system looks like. Don't worry about if it doesn't yet exist. Just sketch out what is the system that's necessary to get a Florida child who's deaf and hard of hearing from birth to literacy. And then you can sketch out what is actually happening, right? But don't think that what you sketch out that's actually happening is actually happening. Because there's really good work happening out there that half of us don't know about. And then there's really not so good work that we think is good work happening. So sketch out what you think is happening, but then you're going to have to go out and do some digging and actually put your eyes and your hands on what's happening. Talk to families, and don't just talk to families in Tallahassee. Like, I'm all over the place in Georgia. Everybody knows me now because I get in my little car and I drive, I lug materials, I talk to any and everybody that's willing to talk to me, because that's the only way you're going to figure out how to make a system that works for all the users, not just the users who are in Metro Atlanta, because that's what we have a lot, right? Our Metro kids are doing exponentially better than our rural kids. And then parents. The focus on the caregiver, the focus on the family, because ultimately they are the user of the system. So how does their user experience inform your system? It's like when you talk about developing a video game. The developers create the game, and then they trial that game with users. And they ask the user, what did you like about this game? What did you not like? What worked? What should we change? What should we keep the same? You have to do that with the end user of your system, which is the family and the child. And you think you don't, but you do. We make a lot of assumptions about what's working and what's not. We really, really, really do. So you have to talk to the people who are using the system to actually figure out what an effective system looks like, where the failure points are, where the success points are. And don't make assumptions that parents want what you want, because that's not always what they want. We've had some sticky conversations around our goal of literacy for kids with parents who themselves are not literate. How do you have that conversation? How do you do that? How do you respect where that parent is and say that you want a different goal for their child? How do you do that? So you got to really start thinking about those kinds of things. Everybody thinks reading is great. But how do you have a conversation about literacy with a parent that's not literate? And that's a really I mean, that gets at the heartstrings about what it is that we're expecting for these kids, and are we really taking their family's consideration into play? Continuous communication. This is my number one struggle. It is so, so, so hard. If I don't have a meeting and I send emails, nobody reads the emails, and then nobody knows what's going on. If I have a meeting, then people are upset because they took a day off work and they're like, why didn't you just send me an email about this? So you're never really going to win with this, and you have to just try to do a little bit of all of it, because you just never do exactly what everybody wants. So when you think about continuous communication, probably my biggest expense are ASL interpreters. I have ASL interpreters at every single thing that I do. It is my biggest expense. It is also one of my most necessary requirements to make this work happen. And you have to know who your good interpreters are, because I made a misstep when I first took this position and got a not so great interpreter for a very important meeting, and got my you-know-what handed to me on a platter by one of my very good deaf friends, because she was just like, no. You know, this is on you to know who's good. If you have a no-fly list, or if you don't have a no-fly list, you better go ask your deaf stakeholders to give you the no-fly list, because that will be, I mean, that can really break down trust between you and your ASL users if they don't feel like clear, quality communication is a priority of yours. But don't forget, you also have deaf adults who don't use ASL. So what does CART look like? You know, how do you make sure that you have the appropriate auditory system so that your deaf adults who use spoken language can access what you're saying? I mean, there's a lot of times when we'll facilitate, and I'll facilitate with a deaf adult who's using sign. So both languages are represented at, within the meeting. And also the fact that, nothing for us without us, right? So what we really, really, really don't want to be is a coalition for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, only made up of hearing people. And that was a misstep made early on before I took this role. And I think just having a deaf child who uses sign language and who chose at 13 to stop wearing her implant, who probably chose at 10 but just put it on and lied and then got on the bus and took it off and said she was wearing it. I'm really sensitive to that kind of thing. And so when I took the position, I was like, where's all the deaf people? They're like, oh, they're here. It's like the same two deaf people every single time. So I'm like, no, we gotta, but that takes a lot of cultivation and really reaching out in the community. And, it's not just about hearing status either. You really have to find those deaf leaders who are making it about the kids. Because I've got some deaf adults that I had to ask not to be in leadership positions because they made it about themselves and what they experienced 30 years ago instead of what deaf kids are experiencing now. It's different. What's going on is different. There are some things that are the same, but there are some things that are very, very different. And if you can't check what happened to you at the door so that you can really focus on what's happening to our kids now, you're probably not going to be my most effective leader. And so, this work doesn't stop, and I still have really good leaders from every walk of life, whether they're, hearing or deaf or early interventionist or medical professionals. I still have to sit down with people and say, whoa, that didn't fly. You cannot say that in this meeting. That is not respectful to my stakeholders. That is not respectful for the people who were showing up, and I can't have it. So let's talk it through. Food is a great way to get people to get together. So I know as the Department of Education, you cannot pay for food, which is really great reason to write for grants and work with nonprofits because they are way more flexible about what they can spend money on. So when I first came aboard, one of the things that we did was when I was introducing myself to people and when we were getting stakeholders together that didn't always look at each other as human beings, we went to a really nice restaurant, not like, Chili's, like a really nice, cool, awesome restaurant in downtown Atlanta. And we had bottles of wine and we ate food. And people who could not be in the same room together all of a sudden sat down, they broke bread, they loosened up with a cocktail or a glass of wine, and they started talking about the fact that, oh my gosh, my kid plays soccer, and your kid plays soccer, and all of a sudden that person that was an enemy became a human being. And I tell you, food and alcohol will help your relationship building. And oh Lord, you're recording this, but honestly, it really is the truth. And I say that because it's an untapped potential when we work with state agencies because we are not allowed to pay for that kind of thing. But it really does make a huge difference when you're talking about relationship building and humanity. And if you have food and you can't have alcohol because that just gets a little too weird, fine, don't do that. But it's been a game changer for us in how we can sit down and really look at each other outside of the work and become friends and allies and human beings. And I wouldn't be transparent and I wouldn't be honest if I didn't talk about the role of that kind of social interaction and how that plays into really being able to do authentic work. Yeah, be careful with social media. I mean, Facebook is a really easy way for me to reach out to people. I'm working on our antiquated website that hasn't been updated in the entire time that I've had this position, and I'm really sorry about that, so don't go look at it. But Facebook is a really great thing, but it can get you into trouble. You post something and somebody takes it the wrong way. Oh my gosh, they're counting. There were 4 ASL posts and there were only 3 listening and spoken language posts. And I'm like, holy moly, are you in high school? This is so ridiculous. But it's there, and you have to have it in your brain when you're doing this kind of stuff, because what you think is a completely innocuous post that nobody's going to get upset about, all of a sudden, it's a new war. And sometimes taking stuff down makes it worse than just leaving it and riding out the wave. Just telling you. So email blasts are great. Half the people I email don't even open it. So just know that if something is really important, you might have to email multiple times. You might have to put all caps in the subject. You might have to follow up with a personal email to one single person. Don't think, my husband always tells me, Stacey, you need to verify and clarify. Verify and clarify. I got myself in trouble thinking that because I emailed somebody something that they knew. Then I had a meeting and the person that should have been there didn't come, and then they got really mad because there was a meeting without them. I'm like, I sent you 48 emails. And my husband's like, but did you verify and clarify that that person knew? Did you actually pick up the phone because they didn't respond to 48 of your emails and say, are you coming to this meeting? And I was like, no. And he said, well, then it's your fault. It's your fault. If that person needs to be there in every way that you've tried to contact them, they have not responded to. He's like, if you had called and they hadn't responded to you, it still would have been your fault because you have it within your power to drive to their center and walk in the door and go to their office and say, hey, I need you here. And you haven't responded to me. So my husband is a business owner. He has a way different perspective about how this stuff happens. He's like, I don't want to hear about the feelings. Take out, he said, scrub every feeling that you have about this situation and then tell me what happened. And I have to sit there for like 15 minutes before I can even have a conversation with him, because I'm like, how do you not have feelings about something? It's children. And he's like, but that's not what this is, Stacey. This is still a business, right? We're looking at this like it's a calling, and it is, but that's what gets us into trouble too. This is about a business. That we are in the business of making readers. And if you get distracted by your calling for deaf kids, your business will suffer and your profits will go down. And so it's really nice if you have a business person that you can go and talk to. I mean, if you are a business person, great, you're better than me. But I go home and I talk to him, and he gives me a really nice perspective. And he also tells me, you have to own this. This was your screw up. Now you have to go own it. How are you going to fix it? Let's talk through it. I have been humbled many more times than probably any other emotion since I've taken this job. Because, you know, you think you have all the answers. I've worn a lot of hats. I've had a lot of different perspectives from all of these different opportunities. And you come in thinking, I know how to fix this, or I've got this really great idea. And you don't, because you cannot fix what we are dealing with. Us, we, y'all, the gang, yous guys, that's who's going to fix the problem, not me or I or you. So you just really got to think about that from that perspective. You already have RMTC, so you're probably light years ahead of what you need in terms of continuous communication and tech, but we're working on it. We're working on it. If you create a coalition, we have 100+ people in our coalition. You are not getting anything done when 100 people sit down in a room. So remember, coalition meetings are really to give out those overarching informational type messages. The real work gets done in small targeted work groups with the people who really need to be in the room around that work. We all have opinions about early intervention, but I don't need a teacher who is combative with the early intervention agencies in the early intervention meeting about how I'm going to train general early interventionists around DHH delivery models. I don't need her there. So I update her later at the large coalition meetings, and I keep my work groups very targeted, and they'll be fluid. Because somebody that will need to be in the first 3 small targeted work group meetings, once you have leveraged their expertise, they may not need to be in the next 4. So don't beat people over the head with meetings they don't need to be at, because that's one of the ways that you're going to demotivate people to be involved with the work. And it just takes time to learn who needs to be there. It just takes time. Last but not least, okay, I'm doing okay. Last but not least is a backbone organization. This is staff people with specific skills, but they serve the entire initiative. So Dr. Kenny Moore is our director of state schools at DOE. Comer Yates is the executive director at the Atlanta Speech School. They are my bosses, if you will. They don't like to call themselves that, but when I get in trouble, I answer to them. And when I do good things, I also answer to them. But they created this coalition. They came together and they said, kids at the speech school, private school using listening and spoken language. There's an audiologist on staff all day long, 24 hours a day. Not, you know what I mean. Our outcomes aren't any better than the outcomes at the state schools, where kids are in a bye-bye setting. And these 2 outcomes are not any better than the kids in the local school systems. Nobody's winning the fight. So we might as well fight the fight together instead of fighting each other and the fight. And so that's really who created this coalition, and it has been a game changer. So we've got major people from DPH, major people from DECAL, D-E-C-A-L, Department of Early Care and Learning. They come together, but they answer to the entire stakeholder, the entire coalition, all the stakeholders. We were established 8 to 9 years ago, and initially all the positions, like I said, were volunteer. In May of 2015, that's when I started my position. We wrote for a grant, or we, that's the royal we, the people before I came here wrote for a grant, and Oberkotter agreed to fund a full-time director's position, my position, for 3 years. My position is up in May of 2018. We had the opportunity to write again for 3 more years for this position, but Kenny Moore, Dr. Kenny Moore at State School said, I think that the environment is primed for me to go to those above me at DOE and make your position a full-time permanent position at the Department of Education. And so we decided to do that instead because it lent itself to the sustainability of this work. It's really nice to have grant money. It is very nice to have flexible, ability to use your funds, but at the same time, that's temporary. So if we want all this good work to keep going, then we needed to get some permanent positions, which is why we wrote the bill and why we decided to move to DOE. So I should hopefully start in June 1st, but we're working really hard to make sure that this lasts for a long time. During the time when Oberkotter was funding my position, so all they did was fund my position, that's it. The rest of the money that we used was we got in different places. So the Georgia Department of Education gave me an annual operating budget of $48,000 a year. Doesn't sound like a lot, but we figured out how to stretch it. And then they paid for, in addition to that, they paid for every sign language interpreting, every CART service. They paid for all of that. So DOE really came and backed up this work. And if you look at who, not that any one department is responsible for what's going on with DHH kids literacy. We're all responsible. But of those years, from birth to 8 years of age, 5 of those years are spent in DOE. So they really did put their money where their mouth was and said, hey, if you're going to do this work, we're going to meet you where you need to be. And they have been incredible, from giving me iPads so we could do tele-coaching for early interventionists across the state, to providing interpreters, to spending $20,000 on Foundations for Literacy kits. Any teacher in the state of Georgia gets trained for free in Foundations for Literacy. That's a DHH teacher. They get trained for free and they get a free kit. And so DOE has really been incredible. And the partnership with DPH has been good too, but it has not been we have not been partnered with DPH as long. So we're working on that. And then the Atlanta Speech School has acted as my fiscal agent. So my health insurance and all of that comes through the Atlanta Speech School. And we have lots of in-kind donations. So if I print anything, laptops that I need for my personal usage, printers at home, things like that, that all comes from the Atlanta Speech School. I do have an Atlanta Speech School email address, but I found out really early that that did not make me look like a neutral party. And I also have a cubby or a cubicle at the speech school, but having a meeting at the speech school also did not make me look like a neutral party. So I work primarily out of my home now, and I go to people. And I do things like, if we have a coalition meeting at the Atlanta Speech School, we have quarterly coalition meetings. So if I have one in the fall at the Atlanta Speech School, then my winter meeting is at the Atlanta Area School for the Deaf, and my spring meeting is at the Auditory Verbal Center, and then my summer meeting might be at a local school system. That takes a lot of logistical time, but once you kind of figure out a few meeting areas that show your coalition that you really are working towards not neutrality, but that everybody has an equal place at the table, you will all of those things matter so much. So I have a Gmail account right now, and that's what I answer all my emails. And if you email me at the speech school, it goes to my Gmail, and then I answer you from Gmail, because reality is perception, right? Perception is reality. People perceive something and that becomes their reality. So I've had to work really hard about, what does this look like? Not what did I mean, but what does this look like to that person I'm trying to get involved? Systems level perspective. I think this is my last slide, but think about the system from the child's perspective and the family's perspective, because ultimately they are the end user. And these are just questions for you maybe in your breakout, depending on what you're going to do. Who needs to be involved in the system? And that is a very different question than who wants to be involved in the system. And again, that's also some sticky situations where people want to be involved in meetings and they just don't need to be there. They are an obstacle to the work. They are a distractor to the work. Or they just don't have the expertise or the knowledge necessary to be effective in that meeting. So you have to be really careful about, where do I need you? How do I leverage your expertise? And when do you just not need to be there? And how do you convey that in a way that doesn't deflate people or anger people or make people think you're keeping something from them? That's my number one response. Why wasn't I involved in that meeting? What's going on? Well, it's not about anything that you're not going to know about. Everything that we try to do is, I try to do everything as transparently as possible. But you know, sometimes you'll still make a misstep and you just have to apologize and own it and move forward and say, how can I resolve this so that this doesn't happen again? What do I need to do for you to make you feel comfortable that if I have a meeting that you're not there for, you still feel like you can trust what happens in that meeting? What can I do for you? Tell me, what can I, help me help you, right? Show me the literacy, right? So what work are people responsible for? Don't ask the Department of Education to do work that the Department of Public Health is responsible for. You have to really think about, who is responsible for this work? You know, state schools is paying for early intervention for kids with sensory disabilities, but all the federal money in Georgia for early intervention goes to the Department of Public Health. So why is state schools and DOE paying for that when the money, the federal money and the state money, is going to DPH? And how do we connect those people without going in and saying, DPH, you're not paying for what you're supposed to? Like, you can't do that, because then the door's just shut. So who's responsible, but then how do you hold them accountable in a way that doesn't become an obstacle to the work, right? When should the work happen? So think about timeliness. How do you ensure quality? Sometimes people just think, oh, it's available to them. Yeah, but it's crap. That's great, but I don't want that. That's crap. You know, that's like fake chicken. That's what I'm moving towards veganism, and my daughter is like, that is fake chicken. No. So, I mean, think about, is this quality? Does this actually do what you want it to do? How do transitions happen? We are having a real struggle from Part C to Part B transition in the state of Georgia. A real struggle. We have kids who have 3 years of early intervention and transition into nothing and then show back up at the age of 6 in the school system. We knew where they were for 3 years. They dropped off the map for 3 years, and then they showed back up. Like, we are seriously struggling with Part C to Part B. So how do transitions happen, and how do you make them more effective? And where they are effective, how do you replicate it? And then last but not least, I've said this a million times, where do parents fit into the system? You know, we look at Medicaid, and we have straight Medicaid in Georgia, and we have 3 CMOs. And at any given point, depending on your family's income or household number, or, you know, whether or not, you know, it's sunny outside, they will move families from straight Medicaid to Peach State to Well Care. Well, every single one of those have different policy coverage. Some of them cover speech language therapy for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, and some of them don't. So you go from having full coverage for language therapy to being moved over to a Medicaid CMO without the parent ever being contacted and told. They show up at their therapy. The therapist goes to get reimbursed, and all of a sudden they're on a completely different policy, and it doesn't cover therapy anymore. And so that therapist has to decide, do I keep seeing this kid and scholarship them? Or do I fight this? Do I try to help the parents? So, you know, just be tender to those families, because this is really hard. It's really hard, and they don't have the knowledge that you have a lot of the times, and they feel crucified a lot of the times. and they want to give up, and some of them do give up. And it gets us to the exact opposite endpoint that we're really, we mean so well, and then we get us to the exact opposite endpoint. We have kids that just don't get to where we're trying to get them to. So just take that as my last offering. And that's it. That's it.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I understand how importantly the third grade outcome reading on the third level would be. I understand that. Did you consider the third grade as a minimum or maximum?
Nope.
Third grade would be a minimum. Third grade would be a minimum.
So if I understand you correctly, so we have the potential to increase that, possibly to encourage more further literacy development?
Yes. So our goal right now is third grade literacy, because that's our first major transaction that's a failure point, right? We know that first major transaction in terms of that larger literacy, third grade reading, if they're not there, everything else that comes afterwards it's like hunting for magical unicorns. Like, if I'm going to get you into college, if I'm going to get you a general ed diploma, if I'm going to get you graduated and into a job that's not menial labor or funneling you straight into SSDI, if I'm going to do that, you have to read at the third grade level. And what we did was very strategic in picking that goal, because our state and our governor was already looking at that goal. So we're like a blip on the radar. We're an ant in the picnic of what's going on, right? Like, they're trying to stamp us out more than they're trying to actually include us, right? We're so small. We're so small. So we thought strategically, how can we make this really small, overlooked population matter? Well, the state is looking at literacy for all kids, and their marker for literacy right now is third grade. So we're going to make that our marker too. So now we matter to what's going on in our state. But what we've also done is shop ourselves as the canary in the coal mine. When you figure out how to make this system work for kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, you probably figured out how to make it work for kids with vision impairments and kids with Down syndrome and families who speak a second language, because DHH kids run across all populations, all ethnicities, all races, all income areas, all locations in the state. It's not like we're talking about one particular, yes, we're talking about one particular kind of kid when we're looking at deaf and hard of hearing, but that includes all kinds of kids and families from all over the place. So we're not myopic in what we're trying to do. We were strategic. How do we make this small population matter? Well, one, we're going to tie it into what's already going on in our state around literacy. And two, if you can figure it out for these kids, all of the lessons learned for DHH kids can be applied to almost any other child population that we're dealing with. And then once we figure out third grade literacy, then we'll move from there. Let's talk about what middle school looks like. Let's talk about what high school looks like. Let's talk about what transition looks like. We have some incredible career readiness programs in the state of Georgia. I just toured a few facilities. They literally have real welding studios and real restaurant like kitchens, and they've duplicated child care centers in high schools, and our kids with disabilities are not really taking effective they're not really engaging effectively in these career readiness programs, and they are incredible. It's like we're feeding this myth to people that the only way to matter as a student is to graduate and go to college, and that's just crap. I mean, my husband did not go to college, and he owns 4 businesses. I have a PhD and he makes more money than I do. And I'm not saying money matters in terms of happiness or value, but we kind of are feeding that myth to kids and to educators and to the general public that if you don't graduate and go to college, you're not successful. And I went into these high schools and these kids are doing things at the age of 15 that at 37, I mean, I don't know how they're doing it. It is incredible, but are specifically through my lens of DHH kids, they're not engaging in these incredible programs that are out there. So we're not stopping at third grade literacy, but that's not our end point in the journey. It's just our first stop in the journey, and we were very strategic in choosing that because it was already determined to be a statewide goal. I hope I answered. I feel like, did I answer your question? I think so. Okay.
More about, oh, sorry.
No.
I would like to know more about how you get the parents involved. Even I'm looking at this the pathway, and even the medical community, we still struggle with pediatricians who, oh yeah, it's okay, he'll get better. You know, how do you do this?
You just asked me about my two biggest holdouts. I told you I'd be transparent. They're my two biggest holdouts. Medical professionals don't really like when educational professionals come in and tell them what to do. They really don't like that. So I did that. Didn't work out well for me. So what I realized was I have to find somebody within that medical community, and then they have to do that work. And I think I have finally found that person, because you also have to think about, so with audiologists, I can't just use any audiologist. I need a pediatric audiologist to talk to my general audiologist, who are probably the ones seeing kids in rural areas, right? Because there are very rarely pediatric audiologists in rural areas. So in terms of medical professionals, it's still a work in progress, and my best piece of advice right now is you can't do it as an educator. You have to find someone from within the community that can do that work, that you can partner with. Getting the Department of Public Health involved is going to be necessary. I mean, we've gone back and forth about, do we withhold licensing from audiologists who see pediatric patients who don't go through a DHH specific pediatric professional development module? Because that's what we thought about doing in Georgia. We're going to develop a online module that's specific to pediatric audiologists, and then we're going to require audiologists that see pediatric patients to go through this module. And if they don't, then we won't, do their renew their licensing or their certification. And we're like, yeah, we're going to do this. This is what we're going to do. And then someone came to us and they said, you know that audiologist in South Georgia that sees all the pediatric patients that's not a pediatric audiologist? They're just not going to do the module, and then they're just not going to see those pediatric kids because they're not making that much money off of them anyway. So you have to really think about unintended consequences. And so that's where that leveraging your stakeholders' expertise comes into play. So that's the best information I can give you right now. We also struggle with pediatricians. Oh, it's just fluid on the ears. Don't worry about it. So we have two projects happening right now. One is called Talk With Me Baby, and it is a nurse, a curriculum for nurses in birthing centers and hospitals, where the nurses, who are the number one people that have transactions and interactions with families in birthing hospitals, they're trained on language nutrition. And they're trained around the urgency of diagnosis and the urgency of the enrollment in early intervention. They're the ones who are giving those newborn hearing screenings. So if there's a does not pass, they don't say something like, oh, it's probably going to be fine. It's just fluid on the ears. Don't worry about it. They really do understand, look, you need to follow up. This is really, really important. It could be nothing. And so I don't want to scare you, but if it is something and you don't do something now, it's going to have some really negative consequences. Maybe those are not the exact words, because, you know, all that stuff is really sticky. But so we've got Talk With Me Baby, that's looking at nurses and how they interact with families in the birthing hospitals. And then we've just recently gotten funded for what's called the Grady Baby Grant. Grady Hospital is a large hospital in Atlanta, and every child that's born in Grady that does not pass the newborn hearing screening will be sent to an audiologist, and if they don't have transportation, they're going to provide it for them in every single thing that they need for the first, I think it's 6 months, in terms of audiological management, diagnostic testing, language development. It's all going to be provided free of charge to kids who are born at that hospital. Now, this is just a pilot program, and of course it's grant funded, so we don't know the implications in terms of financial implications and staffing implications, but those are 2 projects that we're looking at. And I think we just got funded, or we're writing for the early intervention around the audiological visits, because we still have audiologists who may be diagnosing at 3 months of age, but the kinds of messaging that they're telling parents is working against what we know is best practice. You know, really trying to get away from this, if you sign with your child, they're never going to talk message. Like, it's just pervasive. And especially in Georgia, we have many, many implant surgeons. And so that just is a really pervasive message that we're trying to work around. But I think I talked about this when I came to the FIDA conference, where how can a professional, what an audiologist said to me is, how in good conscience can I tell this family to learn ASL if there is no access to any ASL programs for parents in the state of Georgia? Another one of those come to Jesus moments. Not a single dollar up until last year, and still only $50,000, and it was a one-time grant. Not a single dollar of early intervention money was spent in the state of Georgia on classes for parents to learn ASL. Not a single dollar. So how does so this audiologist is saying to me, I'm not against sign language, but how do I tell this parent to do that and then turn around and there's no access to it? I'd rather put a hearing aid on the kid or get him implanted and try to develop spoken language, because at least I know if they have some access to services that way. And so, you know, that sort of humanized some of that messaging for me in a way that I had never thought about before. So parents are really difficult. So we tried something called Smart and Secure Children. The Satcher Institute at the Morehouse School of Medicine has a parent capacity building program called Smart and Secure Children, and they have implemented it mainly in African American, low income, urban populations. And what they do is they have 10 modules that look at typical information that parents need to know. Everything from how to breastfeed your baby, to brain development, language nutrition, to how to watch TV with your child and still make it be beneficial. What is effective punishment versus not so effective, punishment. And it's an incredible program. And what they do is they go into these communities, and if the elder, if you will, of the community, say, is an older gentleman that owns, and I'm not just making this up as a stereotype, there's an older gentleman, he owns a barber shop, and that's where a lot of the fathers hang out. So they will tap this elder, and they'll say, can we put you through training? And will you be willing to have a father group come in once a week for 10 weeks into the barbershop, and you share these modules, you deliver. We're going to train you how to deliver it. And it's incredible. They show up because it's in their community, in a place they feel valued and safe. And it's being delivered by a person they trust in a language that they respond to. And I mean, it's been incredible. There was a woman who was in sex trafficking, is a huge human trafficking is a huge problem in Atlanta because of the airport. So she was trafficked as a child, became a prostitute as an adult, lost her children, somehow got connected to Smart and Secure Children, became a facilitator, got her children back, testified in front of our General Assembly at the state capitol, and is now a national trainer for Smart and Secure Children. I mean, these stories are like movies that are happening from this program. We tried to implement it for a DHH population in a school setting, and it failed. We could not get parents to show up, and I started going back and going, why is this not working? Why? The school is not a place of safety for a lot of our parents. So one of the major reasons that this program worked the way the Satcher Institute was delivering it was that they were doing it in a location that was safe, and we took that away. Then I had a teacher of the deaf delivering it, and we piloted it. They knew we were making the changes, but I had a teacher of the deaf delivering it. Well, again, that's not a person that's always safe for them. So I can put you in contact with them if you want to. I still think it's an incredible program, but I think just to learn from our lessons, I think it needs to be delivered more closely or more faithfully to the way they're doing it. But they are open to writing more modules. So they're open to people to develop a module around kids with disabilities or specific disabilities, sensory disabilities. They're open to a language model. So there's a lot of potential there. This ASTRA training, it's a parent advocacy training through Georgia Hands and Voices. We did that in South Georgia. I had 3 couples show up, mom and dad. They stayed for an entire 8-hour training, all 3, and it was incredible. I think that there are some tweaks that can probably be made around the ASTRA training because a lot of the information is pretty high level. So you need to be able to take what's on their copyrighted training and you need to be able to deliver it in a way that parents can respond to. But there's so much, it's all about IEPs. And what laws tell you. Like, I didn't know that a school had to provide access to an audiogram, a child getting an audiogram, to no charge to the parent every single year. Because I came from a county that had an audiology program, and the school bus picked the kids up if they needed to, and it drove them to the audiologist, the county audiologist. They got an audiogram, and then it drove them back to school. But in South Georgia, because I work with South Georgia a lot, there is not even a contract audiologist for the school district. And so these parents didn't know that the school had to provide access to one audiogram a year free of charge. I didn't even know that. So there's a lot of stuff around IEPs and the law that are really helpful to parents and to teachers if you're trying to help build parent capacity around what the school system can do for students. It's great. It's really, really great. So I would suggest looking into that, but parents are tough.
Have you partnered with Early Head Start or Head Start at all?
That's our decal. Have I partnered with Early Head Start? That's Department of Early Care and Learning in Georgia. So we just now started our partnership with them. We're working on DHH specific training for child care providers. We're working on so the randomized control trial for Foundations for Literacy, 49% of the kids that were deaf and hard of hearing got foundations with other kids with typical hearing. So we now have research that says that Foundations for Literacy works with kids with typical hearing too. So we're taking that and we're going to Head Start and we're going to see if they're going to let us start training their teachers in Foundations for Literacy. So if we have DHH kids hanging out in those classrooms, we know that they're going to get what they need, but that the curriculum that they're delivering for our kids is also still good for all of their other kids as well. And now that we have evidence behind it, I think it will be an easier sell. But it is difficult. Head Start has a lot of requirements on what they have to do. So, but we've just started with that. Yeah, it's a lot.
We were wondering if you could go back and clarify that law about the audiogram. Is that IDEA law or is that Georgia law?
No.
About the audiogram once a year.
All the law that they talk about in ASTRA training is federal law. None of it is state specific because any Hands and Voices can deliver that ASTRA training. So they didn't want state specific laws to be in there that didn't apply to, you know, they don't.
You repeat that piece of that law, because I think there were several of us that went about the once-a-year audiogram provided by the school district.
To kind of clarify that too, so an audiogram is required by by an IEP to be DHH. Because the school requires that, the school has to provide that.
That is correct.
So we kind of do that. So that's the specific thing. You know, that's why at IEP meetings when they're like, oh, you need this, this, and this, and this, and you're like, no, don't say that, because now we have to do that. So that's why we have to provide audiograms. Some people are very disclosive, you know, are very informative and let people know, like, if you can afford it, we'll provide. Or you have a deaf ed, like we get kids in Pasco County, the first thing we do is, do you have a current audiogram? No, we have 2 that work in Pasco County, this location, you're more than welcome. They have a booth, they can do a full audiogram. Oh, you have your own? Perfect. You have your own audiologist? Perfect. So we really do we facilitate that, but because we require it means we have to do it.
That is correct. That is correct. So 1 audiogram a year. The school is responsible for providing access for a family to get 1 audiogram a year because it is required in eligibility or IEP, things like that. Yeah. And they can even be required to provide transportation to that to that audiogram, audiological visit.
I think I just want to clarify. I don't think the question was specific to whether or not the audiogram had to be provided. It was the timeline. Because is it 1 year or is it 3 years? Because according to IDEA,
eligibility is every 3 years.
It's triennial, yes. So that's why we were all like.
I think it could, I guess, potentially depend on what. So in the county that I worked in Georgia, they still wanted an audiogram every year. Even though IDEA required it every 3 years, the county wanted it every year. And because the county was requiring it every year, they had to provide access to that audiogram every year. Yes, so overall, I would say probably if you're going to be talking about absolutely positively, it's every 3 years. And then depending on what the county is requiring, it can be up to once a year. Yes. Okay.
Right. It ties into reasonable. So and your local and your state eligibility rules. So depending on what your state eligibility rules say, or if you suspect a change in hearing, then those 2 things may indicate a more frequent need than 3, or and because our state eligibility rule does not require 1 every year, right? So then we would not need 1 unless you suspect a change.
In my district locally, we said we want 1 every year,
right,
unless it's been a stable hearing loss for however long.
Right.
And so we do offer that, because in all IDEA, everywhere it talks about evaluations, it always says at no cost to the parents.
Right, exactly. And there were other things. Parent training can actually be written into an IEP. So if you say that a parent is supposed to follow up with math content at home as a way for that child to develop math understanding, and that parent isn't able to support that child's math learning at home because they don't know the content related signs, that can be written in an IEP that the school system has to provide training around content area signs for that parent, so just things like that it makes sense once you say it out loud, but when you get in an IEP, especially in these rural areas where people they just don't know what they don't know, to have somebody come in and say, no, this is available to you, and this is why, and this is how you rationalize this to people that just don't know. It was really incredible. There was a family who is in South Georgia, and their child is at the residential school for the deaf, and it's a 12-hour drive. And they were really upset because the school was upset with them for not attending IEPs. But they had 3 other children, and they were had a lower income household. They had 3 other children, and for one of the parents to go, they actually had to take out a loan to be able to pay for the gas and the hotel, and then they had to make sure that they could get 2 days off work, or they had to make that drive. I mean, and I'm thinking, well, you know, the school for the blind is about 2 hours. The state school for the blind is about 2 hours from your county school. So why don't you guys have the IEP there? And then the staff people can stay in the residential school for the blind. The staff people from the state school for the deaf can stay in the dorms at the school for the blind, no cost to the state. And then the parents just have to make a 2-hour drive to the IEP. And then we get what everybody's looking for, which is parent engagement. But the schools never suggested that. And the family didn't know that was a possibility, and the local school teacher didn't know that was a possibility. And so, you know, mom and dad are crying because they want to be involved in their child's life, but financially, they just can't get there. So it was just, it was very eye-opening. Guys, it was a great training, so I'd really suggest that you look into it, with the caveat that it is really high-level information and probably needs to be massaged a little bit in terms of who your audience is.